Claiming to be a prophet or messenger from God carries with it a certain responsibility. By doing so, one is proclaiming a sacred covenant between oneself and God. As a society, we're all too familiar with how these proclamations can become twisted to the point where these self-professed men of God use their manipulation and status to commit the most shocking blasphemy, breaking the ultimate commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." On April 17, 1989, Jeffrey Lundgren, a self-professed prophet, did just that by executing 5 innocent people in cold blood. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was born on May 3, 1950, in Independence, Missouri, the son of Don and Lois Gadbury Lundgren. Jeff's father had a prosperous job in construction, and his mother did her best to meet the needs of Jeff and his younger brother while taking care to see that the household was kept in immaculate order. The Lundgren family were very active participants in the local Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints, RLDS, a splinter of the Mormon Church. Friends of the family have said that while the Lundgrens did their best to raise the children, they were anything but role model parents. Don was very strict with the children, often seriously punishing them for trivial childish infractions, while Lois was oftentimes distant and inflexible. Jeff states today that he was physically abused as a child. However, these claims have yet to be confirmed by any close member of the family. During his teen years, Jeff had very few friends and was considered an arrogant loner by classmates. A neighbor recalls one day having witnessed Jeff nail a small rabbit to a piece of wood before beating it to death. Besides the obvious animal cruelty, it's noted that psychologists have long claimed that youths who abuse animals are most likely to commit acts of violence later in life. As Jeff grew older, his father decided to share his passion of hunting and guns with his elder son. Don would often spend hours with Jeff, teaching him how to care for and maintain firearms, and eventually how to use them for survival and hunting. Upon graduating from high school, Jeff enrolled at Central Missouri State University, majoring in electronics. During his sophomore year, he spent most of his free time at an RLDS student house. It was there that Jeff met Keith Johnson and Alice Keeler. While he didn't realize it at the time, these new friends would have a significant effect on his life and beliefs. Alice Elizabeth Keeler was born on January 21, 1951, in Max Creek, Missouri, 160 miles outside of Independence. Proud parents Ralph and Donna Keeler were delighted with their firstborn child. Ralph was a veteran of World War II and employed as an ironworker. Donna stayed at home, raised the children, and took care of the home. Ralph wasn't around much during Alice's childhood, as his job was some 150 miles from home. Weekends were usually the only time the family was able to spend time together. 2 sisters and a brother eventually joined Alice. She seemed to be a happy child up until the age of 12, when her father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Ralph was no longer able to provide for the family, and money soon ran short. Donna took a secretarial position at the local welfare office in order to support the family. The brunt of Ralph's illness and child-rearing rested on Alice's shoulders. Ralph was soon on a wide variety of cocktail medications, including prednisone and cortisone. These drugs, combined with his growing depression, oftentimes led to violence directed towards Alice and her siblings. During her high school years, Alice was a bit of a loner, preferring the local church youth group rather than participating in school activities. Upon graduating from high school, she enrolled at Central Missouri State University. She became very active in the youth church group and soon took the fancy of Jeffrey Don Lundgren. The two immediately started to spend time together and were soon inseparable. By 1969, Alice was pregnant, and both she and Jeff dropped out of college. Don and Lois were extremely disappointed by their son's irresponsibility and refused to attend the couple's wedding in the spring of 1970. In order to support his new family, Jeff enlisted in the United States Navy. Shortly after leaving for basic training on December 2, 1970, the couple's first child, Damon Paul, was born. Jeff served 4 years in the Navy as an electronics technician before receiving an honorable discharge in July of 1974. 2 weeks before the discharge, Alice gave birth to their second son, Jason Don. Jeff and Alice lived in San Diego, California with their 2 children following his discharge from the service. The couple once again became active in the RLDS church and would oftentimes look for friends to convert to their faith. Supporting the ever-growing family soon became a problem, so Jeff decided to move them back to the Independence area in hopes of securing a well-paying job. Try as he may, he could not hold down any job for more than a few weeks at a time due to his irresponsible nature and attitude. On June 21, 1979, the couple's 3rd child, Kristen Michelle, was born. Some say Alice planned this pregnancy in order to save the couple's marriage and to curb Jeff's wandering eye. Shortly after the birth of Kristen, Jeff would regularly abuse Alice and the children. At one point, Jeff pushed her down a flight of stairs. The fall was so severe that it caused Alice to rupture her spleen. Emergency surgery was required to repair the damage. On September 13, 1980, their 4th child, Caleb Matthew, was born. As with the birth of Kristen, family members speculated that this pregnancy was yet another attempt by Alice to hold their rocky marriage together. In 1981, Jeff was asked to join the RLDS lay priesthood. However, he later stated that it was at this time that he lost all faith in the church and its teachings. Their liberal tendencies, for example, allowing women to be ordained as priests, particularly upset him. Jeff felt that Scripture contained the truth, and it was now his duty to find the answers. He started a Mormon splinter group and began holding study groups in his home. Members included friends from college like Dennis and Tanya Patrick, Dennis and Cheryl Avery, and Jeff's cousin Debbie Olivares. Jeff seemed to have a way with people and attracted a number of followers that truly believed he'd uncovered the truth in Scripture. According to a friend of Jeff's cousin Debbie, people appeared to worship the ground he walked on and would often donate money to support the Lundgren family. Jeff soon grew greedy and became unhappy with the small sums of money that his followers were giving him. He eventually announced to his flock that it was time for him to move on and that the Scriptures were commanding him to move to Kirtland, Ohio, in order to receive his true power from God. Kirtland, calling itself the City of Faith and Beauty, is a typical small town, a tight-knit community situated in northeastern Ohio, roughly 22 miles east of Cleveland. Kirtland was initially part of the Western Reserve, an area that was granted to the Connecticut Land Company. The city has a population of nearly 6,000, with an estimated population density of 353 people per square mile. Individuals born and raised in Kirtland mostly elect to stay there, and their children choose to do the same. While Kirtland may only be 17 square miles in size, several churches of different faiths dot the area. There are some 10 churches in the community, 6 Protestant, 1 Catholic, 3 branches of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and 1 more in the planning stages. On August 19, 1984, the Lundgren family arrived in Kirtland and immediately began to survey the area. Jeff later said that after touring the small town, he felt an undeniable urge to stop at Chapin Forest, a county park located less than 5 miles from the Kirtland Temple. It was here, Jeff would later tell his followers, that he discovered where the Book of Mormon plates had been buried after being brought over from the Holy Land. After leaving Chapin Forest, Jeff and Alice visited the Kirtland Temple and were almost immediately offered positions as temple guides. These duties would include long hours at the Temple Visitors Center giving tours of the temple. In exchange, the church offered free room and board in a home behind the temple and a salary of $125 a week. Jeff relished the fact that he was now able to guide people through the temple and, at the same time, mingle his own views in with those of the church. The Kirtland Temple was constructed in 1833 at the direction of Joseph Smith, Jr. A self-professed visionary, Smith was considered a modern prophet by his followers. Prior to his assassination in Carthage, Illinois, Joseph Smith, Jr. founded several Mormon communities throughout Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio, and was often credited by the church for translating the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith, Jr. told his followers that on December 27, 1832, he received a revelation from God that a temple was to be built in Kirtland. Dedicated in 1836, the temple was one of the largest buildings ever built in northern Ohio. The building's a combination of Greek, Georgian, Gothic, and Federalist architecture styles, and is today designated a National Historical Landmark. The main floor of the Kirtland Temple was at one time used for worship, and the second floor was a school for the ministry. The third floor contained rooms for the Kirtland High School, and the west room on that floor was Joseph Smith Jr.'s office. Today, the Kirtland Temple, owned and maintained by the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is open for tours throughout the year. It wasn't long before Jeff realized that it was utterly impossible to live off the money he was earning from the church. Little by little, he began to skim money from church donations and profits made at the visitor center. Today, the church estimates that approximately $25,000 had been stolen during Jeff's employment with them. Jeff, as he had in independence, began teaching from his home. People were quickly enthralled with his seemingly boundless memory for Scripture and his promises to do good deeds. Rumors were already beginning to circulate that Jeff was more than just a guide for the church and was oftentimes compared to the late Joseph Smith Jr. Whether he was a con man who believed his own con or a delusional fanatic, Lundgren seemed to have a very strong hold over his rapidly growing group of followers. Jeff's former Navy pal, Kevin Curry, traveled to Kirtland in October of 1984 and was shocked to find his old friend at the Temple Visitor Center. Following a tour of the church, Kevin was invited back to the Lundgren household and was immediately taken in by Jeff's teachings, so much so that he relocated to Kirtland and was soon turning over every paycheck he earned to Jeff. During May of 1985, Danny Kraft and Sharon Blunchley came to Kirtland in search of guide jobs. As with Kevin, Jeff quickly took them into the family. While Sharon took care of the various household duties, Danny followed Kevin's example and began contributing his paychecks to the family. On Memorial Day weekend 1985, 20-year-old Richard Brand traveled to Kirtland to partake in one of the temple's well-known tours. A native of Missouri, Richard had been raised in the RLDS Church and had just earned a degree in civil engineering from the University of Missouri. He was engaged to be married and seemed to have his life in order. After taking the temple tour, Lundgren invited Richard into his household. Richard was so impressed with Jeff's teachings that he returned the following year and moved in permanently with a steadily growing family. Richard then invited his friend Greg Winship to the group. Greg, also a college graduate, had recently divorced his wife and currently had no true path in life. Upon visiting with his old friend, Greg was convinced Jeff was a prophet and decided to join the family in order to learn God's message. In August of 1986, Dennis and Tanya Patrick and their daughter Molly moved to Kirtland from Independence, Missouri. Both were active in the RLDS Church and had known Jeff and Alice since CMSU. The young couple, while upset with the abusive manner in which Jeff treated his children, was so fascinated with his teachings that they saw no other alternative than to go along with the group. By September of 1986, Jeff's teachings were becoming extravagant, at times including references to acts of violence and sexual acts. Once a Mormon is convinced that someone is in the same line of succession as Joseph Smith, that new prophet can demand unquestioned loyalty. Some said even to the point of bloodshed. Under the living prophet concept, Jeff became the point of authority in his flock's eyes. Family, friends, advisors, their own reasoning, and even Scripture took a back seat as the prophet's directives became the final authority. Kevin Curry, no longer able to handle the teachings, decided to leave the group. Shortly after Kevin's decision to leave, Jeff began to profess to his followers that he'd begun receiving revelations that named 2 specific dates for the return of Christ. Jeff claimed that Jesus would at that time destroy everyone except those deemed righteous inside the Kirtland Temple. When both dates for Christ's return failed, Lundgren's attention turned to a vision he had that the group was to seize the Kirtland Temple on May 3, 1988, a date with extreme religious substance to the group. It was also Jeff Lundgren's birthday. The plan involved formulating a hit list in which no less than 10 RLDS church officials and area residents, along with anyone who got in their way, were to be executed in what was called a cleansing, which would then trigger an apocalypse. In preparation, the cult began to build an arsenal, marched in uniform, trained themselves to load and unload guns quickly, did calisthenics, studied military tactics, and watched violent movies in preparation for combat. During January 1987, rumors were rampant in the upper stratums of the RLDS concerning Jeff's heretical teachings. Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough had also heard the rumors of Lundgren's activities and questioned him. As expected, this led nowhere. In February, Jeff instructed Dennis and Tanya Patrick to take up residence in an apartment building directly across from the Kirtland police station in order to keep an eye on them. In April of 1987, Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their 3 daughters relocated to Kirtland from Independence, Missouri. Cheryl Lynn Bailey Avery had been born in Washington State in 1947. The schoolteacher had met Dennis Leroy Avery, some 7 years her senior, in 1970. The couple was married shortly thereafter. The couple bore 3 daughters, Trina Denise, born March 7, 1974, Rebecca Lynn, born January 23, 1976, and Karen Diane, born August 3, 1982. Dennis and Cheryl had become involved with the Lundgrens during Jeff's scripture classes in Independence. Unbeknownst to them, Jeff and Alice did not particularly like the Averys and would oftentimes chastise them, claiming that Dennis was weak and shouldn't allow his wife to make all the decisions in the family. Shortly after the Averys arrived in Kirtland, Alice confronted Jeff and asked him why he'd allowed them to come. Jeff replied, "So I can get their money." The Averys had made $19,000 from the sale of their home in Independence. They turned over $10,000 of the money to Jeff after he convinced them that he'd take care of their needs. On or around April 19th, Jeff had a realtor show the Averys some houses that were up for rent in the area. They eventually settled on a small farm located on Chillicothe Road. Jeff accompanied the couple while they looked at the home. The owner, Stanley Skirbis, mentioned at the time that he also had a 15-acre farm available at 8671 Kirtland Chardon Road, just south of Kirtland. Although Jeff said nothing at the time, he made note of the other available home. On Labor Day weekend, Charlie Olson came to Kirtland to visit with her friends Greg and Richard. Char, born in September of 1960, had known Greg all of her life. After she met Jeff, she was extremely impressed and arranged to move in with the family. Shortly after Char's visit, Kevin Curry returned to the group with hopes that he'd been mistaken in his decision to leave. By September, church officials realized the extent of Jeff's unorthodox teachings and revoked his ministerial credentials. Angered, Jeff immediately withdrew his membership. Dale Luffman, president of the Northeast Ohio chapter of the RLDS, later stated, "He was silenced for ethical reasons. He would have been expelled from the church on the basis of unchristian conduct had he not withdrawn his membership." The RLDS leadership told Jeff to start looking for a new residence. His teachings would now increase in volume and violence. In need of a new residence, Jeff contacted Stan Skirbis regarding the farm property that had previously been available. The property was still vacant, and Jeff arranged to move his family and followers in as soon as possible. Jeff's cousin, Debbie Olivares, joined him at the farm shortly after the relocation. During December of 1987, Ronald and Susie Luff moved to the Kirtland area. Ron had previously met Jeff when he worked as a guide at the temple and had been smitten with his teachings ever since. The Luffs, raised in the RLDS church, had been married in 1981. The couple had 2 children together and appeared quite happy in their life together. It wouldn't be long before the Lundgrens took them in, as they had with countless others before them. Jeff's arsenal began to grow at a rapid rate throughout the remainder of 1987. Jeff's eldest son, Damon, was in charge of training the men in combat and marksmanship skills. Mock scenarios were oftentimes played out at the farm and numerous times at the temple all night. Plans to take the temple were still discussed, and hours were spent going over diagrams of the building and maps of the area. If there was a time to fear Jeff Lundgren, it was certainly now, more so than ever. In February of 1988, Kevin Curry, once again disenchanted with Jeff and his teachings, decided it was time to leave the group and never look back. Kevin was afraid for his life if Jeff ever found him and made sure to cover his tracks when leaving for Buffalo, New York. However, try as he may, he wasn't able to keep Jeff's plans out of his mind and decided to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau, assuming the tip was a prank, decided to call the information over to Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough. Yarborough, 49, had been chief of the Kirtland Police Department for nearly a dozen years. His career started in the military, and when he decided he wanted more of a challenge out of life, led him to law enforcement. Upon receiving the FBI facts, Yarborough was convinced that it was serious and started an investigation into Jeff Lundgren and his followers. Jeff, still smoldering about the treachery of Kevin Curry, was even angrier when Char told him she was leaving the group. She'd wanted to leave for some time, but also feared that she'd be murdered. Finally, she got up enough courage to walk out of the Lundgren home in May. Char later said that she had felt that anyone who continued to follow Jeff's teachings would wind up dead or in prison. Throughout the remainder of the summer, Jeff and his followers regularly gathered at the rented farmhouse for scripture studies that often lasted for hours. Lundgren frequently wore military fatigues during the sessions and would keep a loaded pistol within reach at all times. Jeff fed the group a hybrid mixture of biblical and Mormon scriptures, all interpreted to meet his own personal goals. Most anything could be a sin: adding too much garlic to a meal, as Dennis Avery did at times, or keeping money for oneself. On February 18, 1989, Jeff invited his old friend Larry Keith Johnson to the farm. Larry and his wife Kathy readily accepted the offer and began their move from Missouri to Kirtland. Larry, an old-time friend of Jeff's from CMSU, had married Kathy Renee Hubbard Johnson during her freshman year in 1976. The couple had 4 children together and had remained good friends of the Lundgrens throughout the years. On April 4, 1989, following Jeff's instructions, Greg Winship and Debbie Oliveras were wed in a ceremony performed by Jeff himself. The following day, Richard and Sharon were married in an identical ceremony. Within 2 months of the wedding, Sharon was pregnant with the couple's first child. From the beginning, Jeff Lundgren had promised his followers he would take them to see God. To make the journey, he said, the cult first had to seize the Kirtland temple and kill anyone who tried to stop them. However, as time went on, Jeff began to revise this plan and claimed to have a vision that told him the sacrifice of the Avery family would be enough for the group to reach their goal. Jeff felt Cheryl Avery was headstrong and that her children were unruly. Dennis was beginning to question Jeff's teachings during class. No one ever questioned Jeff's word, and the others in the group couldn't understand why Dennis couldn't comprehend the potentially lethal ramifications of his actions. The group considered all the traits the Avery family showed as extremely sinful. In Jeff's eyes, their death would cause the others to fear and respect him. It was time to show the group just how far he was willing to go in order to obtain his goal of total domination. On April 10th, Jeff decided to put his plan into action and ordered Keith and Ron to begin digging a pit in the barn to conceal the bodies. The men were instructed to make certain that they were out of the barn whenever Dennis was around the house. They made plans to abandon the farm after the murders were committed. They instructed the women of the house to begin packing all the belongings. Jeff informed the Averys that the group was going on a wilderness retreat and that they should prepare to leave Kirtland. The roughly 6-foot by 7-foot by 4-foot pit took 4 days to complete. Often, we as a society cannot comprehend how individuals are so taken in by cults and religious sects. Paul R. Martin, a PhD from Wellspring Retreat and Resource Center, contends that cult mind control renders its victims virtually irresponsible for their actions or beliefs. The process whereby he or she was drawn into the cult has a subtle but powerful force over which he or she has little or no control, and therefore they need not feel either guilt or shame because of their experience. Under mind control, a man may be persuaded to believe or do things that would have normally violated his conscience. His conscience may tell him that an action or belief is wrong, but what the cult leader has persuaded him of has so strongly influenced him that it may override his conscience. He may be led to believe that the promptings of his conscience are really of his lower nature, of the flesh, and that the mission of the group is of a higher purpose, that the thoughts of his conscience are doubts that show lack of faith or signs of rebellion. Thus, he may still have a conscience, but through the powerful influence of the group, he's reinterpreted it or reframed his moral outlook. Most people who join cults think they're joining a good group, a moral group, a healthy group. However, this is largely because they've not been afforded full information about the group they're joining. We'd agree that those who join cults are guilty of not asking all the right questions, of not examining the cult's claims thoroughly enough against the records of history and scripture, of not adequately applying the rules of logic to the group's teachings and explanations, and of not having an adequate knowledge of coercive persuasion techniques. In other words, cult recruits are guilty of allowing themselves to be deceived. But is that a sin? Should we rebuke the victim of a con artist for allowing himself to be victimized? Do we blame the battered wife for falling in love with and marrying a batterer? On April 17, 1989, Jeff and the group moved all of the Avery's belongings to the farm and rented them a room at a nearby motel. The following day was to be when the group set off on their wilderness retreat. Everyone in the house except the Averys knew that this would be their last meal as the group sat down for supper at 6:30 p.m. that night. The mood in the group was solemn. Most had come to accept that the Averys had to pay for their sins. Following dinner, Jeff retreated to the bedroom and called all the men, less Dennis, into the room. As the men walked in, he produced a .45 Colt Combat Elite from the holster on his hip and asked the men one by one whether they were with him or not. Each one showed his support and followed Jeff out to the barn. Once in the barn, Jeff explained that they would bring the Averys out to the barn one at a time, whereupon they would bind them with tape, place them into the pit, and execute them in a surrealistic concentration camp style. Jeff asked the men if they had any questions. There were none. Jeff looked over at Ron Luth and said, "Let's do it." Jeff stood over by the pit, and Ron walked out of the barn towards the house. When Ron entered the house, he asked Dennis to come out to the barn and give him a hand preparing equipment for the wilderness trip. Dennis agreed and followed Ron into the night fog towards the barn. When he entered the barn, Ron produced a stun gun and attempted to immobilize Dennis with it. The gun, however, was of low voltage and simply caused him to cry out in pain. No, this isn't necessary. Please, this isn't necessary. God damn it, God damn it, God damn it. Regardless of his cries for help, Dennis was no match for the others as they held him down and bound him with duct tape. Richard Brand and Danny Kraft lifted Dennis to his feet and dragged him to the pit where Jeff was now sitting on a pile of dirt with gun in hand. The men lowered Dennis into the pit and quickly backed away as Jeff stood up. Greg Winship, standing outside the barn, was given the signal to start a chainsaw in order to muffle the sound of the gun blast. As the chainsaw began to rev, Dennis struggled to his knees. Jeff raised the .45 caliber gun and fired 2 shots directly into his back. When the chainsaw stopped, all that could be heard was one last gurgling sound escaping the body. Jeff left the pit room and called out to the others, "You'd better see what this looks like." One by one, the men obediently filed into the room and looked down into the pit. No one said a word, and after a few brief moments, Ron left the barn and headed back up towards the house. When Ron entered the house, he asked Cheryl to accompany him out to the barn because Dennis needed her help. Cheryl agreed and followed Ron out to the barn. The Avery children, unaware of what was happening in the barn, sat in the living room playing video games and discussing the exciting trip they were to take the following day. One can only imagine the horror that was about to befall them. The wheels were set in motion. There was no stopping Jeff Lundgren now. "Here they come," exclaimed Damon Lundgren from his lookout point as Ron led Cheryl to the barn. In the barn, Ron once again tried to use the stun gun. Again, as before, the gun failed. Ron placed his hand on Cheryl's shoulder and solemnly said, "Just give it up. It'll be easier this way. Just let go." Cheryl did not put up a struggle, sinking down to the floor as the men bound her with the tape. Richard and Ron dragged her over to the pit and lowered her next to the body of her dead husband. Greg started the chainsaw. Richard stood back and watched as Jeff took aim and fired 3 shots. The first 2 struck Cheryl in the right breast. She jerked forward and began to fall back as the 3rd shot pierced her abdomen. Cheryl Lynn Bailey Avery now lay dead next to her beloved husband. Worried that the shots might have been heard, Jeff ordered the men to go outside and check. Satisfied that no one had heard them, Jeff instructed Ron to return to the house and retrieve one of the girls on the premise of playing hide-and-seek. The girls were still playing video games as Ron walked into the house and asked Trina to come out to the barn with him. Debbie Olivares and Susie Luff were pacing back and forth in the living room. "Do you think it's happening?" Debbie asked. "I think so," came the barely audible reply. "Here they come," Damon called out from his lookout as Ron led the innocent 15-year-old towards the barn. Trina stood completely still as the men bound her, most likely unsure what was happening. Once finished securing her ankles and wrists, Richard and Ron picked her up and lowered her into the pit. Trina leaned her head back against the dirt as the first bullet grazed her head. She screamed in pain and fear. The next bullet entered her skull on the left side and exited just below her right ear, killing her instantly. No one seemed to show any concern or remorse over the young girl's death and simply went about checking the premises once again. Ron entered the house and asked Becky and Karen if they'd like to come out to the barn and see the horses. Both girls jumped up eagerly and ran for the door. Ron told them to wait. Only one of them could go out at a time so as not to spook the horse. Reluctantly, the girls agreed, and Karen sat down in front of the television. "Here they come," came Damon's now all too familiar call as Ron and Becky made their way towards the barn. Once in the barn, the men pretended to be playing a game as they bound Becky's hands and feet and picked up the unsuspecting 13-year-old. Richard and Ron placed Becky on top of their mother as they lowered her into the blood-soaked pit. Greg once again started the chainsaw. Jeff fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck Becky in the left thigh, while the second pierced her chest. Afterwards, Greg shut off the chainsaw and entered the barn, walking up to the pit. He witnessed Becky making rasping and gurgling noises as she lay atop her dead mother. A mercy shot was never fired. The men left the young girl to die and went about their plan. Karen was becoming impatient, waiting for her turn to see the horses, and attempted to run out to the barn. However, Debbie stopped her short. "I want my mommy," explained the child. "Don't worry, you'll be with her soon," one of the women replied. Shortly thereafter, Ron entered the house and told Karen it was her turn to see the horses and bent down so he could give her a piggyback ride. "Here they come," Damon cried out for the last time as Ron walked towards the barn with the young child on his shoulders. They taped Karen in the same manner as her sisters before her. Ron then flung the 6-year-old over his shoulder and placed her in the pit next to her sister Becky. The chainsaw was started for the last time. Jeff fired 2 shots, the first bullet striking the child in the chest, while the second pierced her skull, ending her short life in an instant. Following Karen's execution, Jeff instructed Ron and Richard to spread lime over the bodies and cover them with dirt. It took 2 hours for the men to complete their task, at which point they finished up by placing trash bags on top of the grave. Shortly after the bodies were concealed, Alice called the house. "Is the company gone? Can I go home now?" she asked. Alice was calling from the Patrick's apartment. Earlier, she'd left the farm with the younger children before any of the killings took place. "You better wait 15 minutes, Debbie replied. Shortly after Alice returned to the house, Jeff called the Patricks and the Johnsons, requesting their presence for a late-night class. Following the call, Jeff, Damon, and Alice drove to the motel where the Averys were to stay that night and removed all their belongings. Jeff's voice was the only one heard throughout the somber, dead silence during class. At one point, he asked each person in the room to relate their feelings about what had taken place. Richard, the only one with enough courage to speak, said, "No one should have to die that way." Jeff's explanation? It had to be done. It was God's will. The day following the murders, April 18th, was spent preparing for the wilderness excursion. Jeff divided the followers into small groups, which left at different times throughout the night so as not to arouse suspicion. Jeff instructed everyone to meet up at a restaurant in Pennsylvania for further instructions. Following the murders, while on routine patrol, Kirtland Police Deputy Ron Andelsek noticed something odd as he drove by the Lundgren's house. A chill ran over his body as he realized the farm appeared to be abandoned. Why, he thought, would the group just pick up and leave in such an obvious hurry? Jeff decided the group would head for West Virginia, collect their thoughts, and await a sign from God that would instruct them on where to find the golden sword, which some thought to be the sword of Laban, spoken of in the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi 4. Jeff believed that the sword would rest with the golden plates from which Joseph Smith is believed to have translated the Book of Mormon. Jeff eventually settled on a secluded campsite east of Davis, West Virginia, located in the Canaan Valley, approximately 60 miles southwest of Wheeling. The area sits 3,200 feet above sea level, surrounded by the beautiful Appalachian Mountains. From the moment the group arrived at camp, it was obvious that Jeff was going through drastic changes. Jeff was swollen with pride over the unwarranted slaughter of the Avery family. He relished the fact that his followers were now deathly afraid of him, not because of his self-proclaimed prophet status, but because of his callous, cold-blooded demeanor. Jeff would often brag to members that hadn't been present at the murders how each of the Averys had died and how he'd snuffed out their lives without a shred of remorse. The camp was soon converted into a military-style compound. Foxholes were dug and guards were posted on a rotating basis. The men of the group were instructed to use deadly force if anyone attempted to enter the camp. An anti-aircraft submachine gun was also set up in order to shoot down helicopters in the case that law enforcement attempted to drop in unexpectedly. By midsummer, Jeff's teachings were becoming as radical as his attitude. Married men of the group were ordered to turn their wives over to Jeff in order to be cleansed with his seed. Jeff made it quite clear that anyone who chose not to follow his instructions would meet the same fate as the Averys. Tension in the group was growing on a daily basis. Many of the members were beginning to doubt Jeff's status as a prophet. On October 13th, with winter approaching and funds running low, Jeff decided the group would abandon the campsite and travel to Missouri. A friend of Kathy Johnson owned a barn outside of Chillouie and gave the group permission to use it. The group stayed at the barn for approximately a week before Jeff decided they should break up for the winter and reconvene in the summer for another wilderness excursion. Each man was instructed to get a job, provide for his family, and save money to turn over to Jeff in the spring. Richard and Greg saw the breakup as their way out. They no longer believed in Jeff and his teachings and simply wanted to get as far away from him as they possibly could. On October 31st, the two men packed what little belongings they had and walked away. When Richard and Greg were able to leave the group, it gave some of the others a glimmer of hope. A few days later, Kathy and Sharon, both pregnant with Jeff's children, left the group with Ron. By mid-December, Jeff was starting to worry that his former followers might go to the authorities with information about the Avery murders. The Lundgrens and Danny Kraft decided to hide out in Southern California and wait to see what would transpire. After establishing themselves in a San Diego suburb, Jeff rented out a storage locker and stashed most of his guns and supplies. The prophet had no idea how hard his world was about to come crashing down around him. On New Year's Eve, Keith Johnson could no longer tolerate the guilt of his knowledge and contacted an informant friend who arranged a meeting with Kansas City agents. During the meeting, Keith poured out everything he knew about Jeffrey Lundgren and the Avery family murders. Investigators were at first skeptical, but had Keith drop a map of where the bodies were supposedly buried and faxed it to the FBI office in Cleveland, Ohio. When the Cleveland office received the fax with the report, the agent taking the call was less than convinced of the tip's significance. He took no action and simply provided the Kansas City agents with the number of the Kirtland Police Department. As soon as Chief Yarbrough received word of the tip, he assigned Deputy Ron Andelsek to check on the whereabouts of the Avery family. When Andelsek was unable to locate the Averys through friends and family members, He contacted Stan Skirbis and requested permission to search the property at 8671 Chardon Road. Skirbis gave the deputy permission, and on January 3, 1990, Yarborough and Andelsek took the map Keith Johnson had drawn of the barn and located an area in the northeast corner that appeared to have been disturbed. Both officers' hearts sank as they realized that they were most likely standing on the Avery family grave. The Kirtland Fire Department arrived on the scene at 7 o'clock. Following a quick briefing of the situation, the men began to work in the suspected area. After digging just inches into the plot, the men were overcome with a foul, pungent odor. Some gagged, while others had to quickly make their way outside to be sick. The smell became stronger the deeper they dug, and the hole they were creating was filling up with blood-red water. What appeared to be pieces of flesh floated to the top. Shortly after 9 p.m., 30 inches below the surface, they discovered the first body. It was lying on its side and appeared to be of a male. Lake County Coroner William Downing and officers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were immediately notified of the discovery. From this point on, police conducted a meticulous excavation. As news of the discovery hit the airwaves, members of Lundgren's cult started to come forward one by one and tell their version of events in hopes of receiving leniency from the courts. When Ron Luff came forward, investigators were utterly shocked at how cold and remote he was while describing his involvement in the murders. The Avery murders landed in the lap of Lake County prosecutor Stephen Latourette. A Northern Ohio native, Steve had attended law school at Cleveland Marshall College. After serving in the public defender's office, Latourette ran for the office of prosecutor in 1988 and won. From the start of the Avery investigation, Latourette was enraged at the callous execution of an entire family. Prosecutor Latourette wasted no time in obtaining arrest warrants for Jeff Lundgren, Alice Lundgren, Damon Lundgren, John Luff, Susan Luff, Richard Brand, Greg Winship, Danny Kraft, Deborah Olivares, Tanya Patrick, and Katherine Johnson. The warrants were faxed to Kansas City, and by mid-afternoon, Ron Luff, Susan Luff, Dennis Patrick, Tanya Patrick, and Deborah Olivares had been placed under arrest and taken to the Jackson County Jail to await arraignment. The following day, Sharon Blunchley, Richard Brand, and Greg Winship turned themselves over to authorities. On January 5th, Jeff contacted his mother-in-law, Donna Keeler, and asked her to drive to California to pick up her grandchildren. Donna contacted the federal law enforcement officials in Kansas City following Jeff's call and relayed the information to ATF agents. Jeff had instructed Donna to drive west toward San Diego and had provided her with a telephone number so that she could contact him upon her arrival and take custody of the children. The phone number Jeff had provided was quickly traced back to a Santa Fe motel just 6 miles north of the Mexican border. Ohio FBI agent Rick Van Helst immediately boarded a plane and flew to San Diego to supervise the arrest. As agents surrounded the motel, they spotted Jeff using a payphone in the lobby. 5 agents quickly converged on the phone booth and pulled Jeff out. Agent Van Helst placed his service revolver to Jeff's ear and said, "Jeffrey Don Lundgren, you are under arrest for murder." While Jeff was being taken into custody, agents raided his motel room and found Alice, Damon, and the younger children watching television. Damon and Alice were taken with no resistance. The first words to come out of Damon's mouth after officers stormed the room was, "I didn't do the actual shooting." During the search of the suspect's room, agents confiscated 2 .44 Magnum revolvers, a .45 caliber handgun, an AR-15 assault rifle, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, camouflage BDUs, maps, a storage locker receipt, and various Mormon Bibles. Upon completion of the search, investigators followed up on the storage locker receipt and discovered 2 trunks of gunpowder, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, a paramilitary semi-automatic rifle, 2 long guns, and a 9mm semi-automatic handgun identical to ones the agents themselves were known to carry. Agents on the scene considered themselves lucky that the arrests went down as smoothly as they had. One can only imagine the devastation Jeffrey Lundgren could have inflicted had he been able to get to his arsenal before they'd arrived. On January the 8th, 1990, Jeff, Alice, and Damon appeared in a San Diego felony arraignment court. All three refused to waive extradition from California to Ohio and were held without bond pending a review of the hearing. Danny Kraft and Kathy Johnson were still at large, and agents had no idea where they might be. On January 9th, a maid at the Chula Vista Motel found 2 handguns, a large .50 caliber submachine gun, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and documents identifying the occupants of the room as none other than Kathy Johnson and Danny Kraft. On January the 10th, a San Diego patrol unit spotted Danny and Kathy traveling west on Route 78 in Danny's Nissan pickup. They arrested the pair without incident. The following day, appearing before the same judge as the Lundgrens, they too refused to waive extradition and were also held without bond pending a review hearing. On March 7, 1990, Richard Brand pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder in exchange for leniency on the premise that he'd cooperate with the state. Richard was obviously nervous during the proceedings, and his hand shook uncontrollably as he signed the guilty pleas. Throughout the months of April and May, Greg Winship, Sharon Blunchley, Susie Luff, and Debbie Olivares all accepted plea bargains offered by the prosecution. Greg pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder, while Sharon, Susie, and Debbie pleaded guilty to 5 counts each of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. Jeff abandoned his fight against extradition, and the California Supreme Court turned down Damon's appeal to avoid extradition. Police brought Jeff and Damon back to Ohio and incarcerated them in the newly constructed Lake County Jail located diagonally behind the courthouse. On July 24th, Alice Lundgren's trial began. From day one, defense attorneys argued that Alice was an innocent victim swept up in the whole ordeal by an overbearing and domineering husband. One by one, the prosecution played its key cards and had its star witnesses come forward to testify about Alice's demeanor and her role within the group. When she took the stand, she attempted to portray herself as a victim of spousal abuse and explained how Jeff had threatened her life on numerous occasions when he doubted her loyalty. During closing arguments, the defense argued that there was no real evidence linking Alice to the deaths of the Averys, at one point comparing Jeff with Adolf Hitler. On rebuttal, the prosecuting attorney stated, "If Jeff Lundgren is Adolf Hitler, then Alice Lundgren is the angel of death, Joseph Mengele." It took the jury just one day to reach their verdict. As the court was called back into session, the jury forewoman handed over the verdicts. Alice smiled as the judge announced to the court that she'd been found guilty on all counts. People throughout the courtroom applauded as the verdict was being read. Hard-nosed investigators and prosecuting attorneys had a difficult time keeping check on their emotions following the verdict. Judge Mitrovich sentenced Alice to 20 years in prison for each count of complicity to commit aggravated murder and 10 to 25 years for each count of kidnapping. All the sentences were ordered to be served consecutively. All said and done, Alice Lundgren would not be eligible for parole for approximately 100 years. Jeffrey Lundgren's trial began on August 23, 1990. A barrage of law enforcement officers and medical examiners took the stand and described in detail the scene of the crime and the events leading up to Jeff's arrest. However, the most damaging of all evidence came from Jeff's former followers as they described the brutal deaths of the Averys and Jeff's utter lack of remorse. When it came time for the defense to present witnesses, not one person was called to the stand. Not surprising to the prosecution, Jeff himself refused to testify on his own behalf. During closing arguments, the prosecution took the jury back through the testimony and evidence and asked it to return with guilty verdicts on all counts. When it came time for the defense to present its closing arguments, attorneys attempted to present Jeffrey Lundgren as a confused man who truly believed himself to be a prophet that was simply following his interpretation of Scripture. On August 29th, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Jeffrey Don Lundgren guilty on all counts. Jeff showed little to no emotion as the verdicts were read. The penalty phase was set to begin on September 17th. During the penalty phase, members of Jeff's family and various psychologists were brought in to testify on his behalf. Jeff himself even took the stand at one point. In a 5-hour statement, Lundgren explained that he considered himself a prophet and God had told him through interpretation of Scripture to kill the Averys. Dennis, Jeff stated, was a false prophet and had to be killed along with his family. On September 21, 1990, 2 hours after retiring to deliberate, the jury returned with their recommendation that Jeffrey Don Lundgren be put to death 5 times over. Once again, Jeff showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Damon Lundgren's trial began on September 11th. Defense attorneys tried to show the jury that Damon provided little assistance in the death of the Averys and was in constant fear of his abusive father. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of an unremorseful young man who actively participated in the murders and, prior to them, had purchased the lime that had been used to cover the bodies. Following closing arguments, jury deliberation began on September 17th and concluded the following day. The jury found Damon Lundgren guilty of kidnapping and aggravated murders in the deaths of Dennis, Becky, Trina, and Karen Avery. However, he was acquitted in the death of Cheryl Avery. Prosecutors later speculated that the jury, for unknown reasons, must have believed Damon did not actively participate in Cheryl's murder. The penalty phase was scheduled to begin 1 week later. On September 26, 1990, the jury, after having heard testimony from Damon's friends and family, decided to spare his life. Damon Lundgren was sentenced to 20 years to life for each count of aggravated murder. In mid-October, Dennis and Tanya Patrick pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and were each placed on probation for a period of 18 months. On November 5th, Danny Kraft pleaded guilty to 5 counts of aggravated murder and 5 counts of kidnapping. He was promptly sentenced to serve 20 years on each of counts 1 through 5, concurrently with each other, and terms of 10 to 25 years on each of counts 6 through 10. Terms on counts 6 and 7 were to be served concurrently with each other, as well as concurrently with the terms on counts 1 through 5, and the terms on counts 8, 9, and 10 were to be served consecutively with each other and consecutively with those on the first 5 counts. Ron Luff's trial was moved to Lucas County Courthouse in Toledo due to the overwhelming media attention in Lake County. Ron's trial progressed much the same way as his fellow defendants, and just before Christmas, he was found guilty on all counts. Following a brief New Year's break, the jury returned to court with its recommendation: 20 years to life on counts 1 and 2, 30 years to life on counts 3, 4, and 5. The presiding judge followed the jury's recommendation and, with regard to the aggravated murder counts, made the sentences consecutive, imposed sentences of 10 years apiece for counts 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and caused them to run consecutively with the sentences on the first 5 counts. Ron Luff would now spend at least 150 years behind bars before being eligible for parole. Kathy Johnson, Richard Brand, Greg Winship, Sharon Blunchley, Susie Luff, and Debbie Olivares were handed down their sentences at the end of January 1991. Debbie, Sharon, and Susie were given 7 to 25 years. Greg was sentenced to 20 years to life consecutively for each murder count. Richard received 15 years to life, and Kathy was sentenced to 1 year. Alice, Sharon, Debbie, and Susie are currently serving their sentences at the Marysville, Ohio Prison for Women. In 1991, Alice filed for and was granted a divorce from Jeff based on irreconcilable differences and imprisonment. Jeff and Damon currently reside at Mansfield Correctional Institute in Ohio. Jeff spent his free time on death row working on his appeals and writing letters to whomever would correspond with him. Most of his letters were filled with biblical proof of his viewpoints. On April 11, 1999, some of the cult members decided to break their silence. "I've been through that scenario 100 times or more," Ron Luff told the Cleveland Plain Dealer during a prison interview. "I could have put them in a car and taken off. But was that a consideration? A viable option? No." Ron says he was so thoroughly brainwashed by Lundgren that he never even considered helping the Averys. "I still don't know what happened," said Susan Luff, Ron's estranged wife. "Something went terribly wrong. I didn't understand any of it. We were supposed to help the hungry. We were supposed to help the poor," recalls Susan at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. Of course, none of that happened. "I don't want to just be a survivor, but I strive to be a phenomenal woman ready for any task, job, or opportunity that comes my way," Susan Luff said. I know I can give a great contribution to society, as I'm doing everything I can here to give back to society. Ron Luff still refers to his estranged wife as my Susie. Though they've not spoken in many years, he was convinced that she had not come to terms with what happened. Moreover, he was bitter that his in-laws were raising their children. I get Christmas cards, birthday cards, that sort of thing, Ron said. But I really don't have a relationship with my kids anymore. Like Susan, Ron has made a new life behind bars, earning an associate's degree in Christian ministry. God has become so ugly I couldn't go any further, Luff said. I just kinda had to take everything that I ever thought I knew about Scripture and put it completely out of my mind and start over. Hatred is the truest definition of murder, Luff says. I know that I did not hate the Avery family. In that sense, I feel that I'm pretty much at peace with them. I have more freedom here in prison than I did while in the group, former cult member Sharon Blunchley said in a letter from prison. I think that Jeff was merely a monster that, like Frankenstein, took on a life of his own. Blunchley, Luff, Alice, and Deborah Olivares all live at the same facility where officials say they've become model prisoners. Many people still wonder why 12 intelligent, religious individuals chose to follow a prophet whose bizarre revelations finally led them to the gruesome murder of a family of 5 fellow members. In the last 40 years alone, dozens of murders throughout the United States have been linked to authoritarian, self-styled prophets who broke from the Mormon Church and quoted Brigham Young and Joseph Smith as the source of their doctrine. One researcher, Dr. Carl Ratschke, a professor of religion at the University of Denver, Colorado, explains, Mormonism has its own mythology with its origins in secret, buried treasure and all. My hunch is that this cult combined a distorted form of the Mormon belief and, in keeping with a variety of popular occult and New Age teachings, a leader who'd gotten into his own revelations packed it all together to create this mystique. As a Cleveland newspaper explained, the Kirtland slayings, coupled with the reports of violence out of Utah, have caused soul-searching among many Mormons who want an explanation for the violence and cult activities that have been associated with their faith. Giving as one possible answer, the article quoted Sandra Tanner, great-great-granddaughter of Brigham Young and a former Mormon, as saying, "Once you accept that the man you're following speaks for God, then you're left at his mercy. When you give that kind of authority to a man, you're also open to the possibility of abuse." Despite Lundgren's crimes and the negative publicity they generated, the RLDS World Church remains opposed to the death penalty. The Ohio Supreme Court scheduled Jeffrey Lundgren's execution for October 24, 2006. By August 2006, according to the State Attorney General's office, he had exhausted all his appeals. On October 17, 2006, Judge Gregory L. Frost issued a temporary stay of Lundgren's execution. Lundgren sought to join a lawsuit with 5 other Ohio death row inmates challenging the state's death penalty statute, arguing that due to his obesity, the lethal injection would be excessively painful and constitute cruel and unusual punishment. State Attorney General Jim Petro appealed the stay to the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit in Cincinnati, which ultimately allowed the execution to proceed. The U.S. Supreme Court declined a last-minute stay, and Governor Bob Taft denied clemency. On October 24, 2006, Jeffrey Lundgren was executed at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. His body was unclaimed and subsequently buried in the prison cemetery.